Thanks, Larry. I just want to start with a quick poll. Raise your hand if you think the National Flood Insurance Program could be improved. Okay, I'm going to remember every single one of you at the end of this discussion. We're going to come back to that. So there's what, 1,000-ish people in this room, Larry? Okay, we're gonna hold you all accountable at the end of this discussion. So I'm glad to see, I think almost everyone in the room raised their hand. As Larry said, I head up a program at Pew focused on looking at the way that we can improve policy when it comes to flood-related disasters. For those of you not that familiar with Pew, the Pew Charitable Trust is an international nonprofit organization working to improve civic life. We do that by working in across different sectors, everything from health and dental to sharks and fish protection and this issue. We don't have a membership, we are not industry driven, and we really just take a data-driven research approach to improving public policy. And we have a long history of working on issues that sit at the intersection of fiscal responsibility and environmental stewardship, and this is one of those issues. Why do we focus on flooding? I think everyone in this room knows that flooding is the most common and most costly natural disaster in the United States. If you look at the last 10 years, 73% of presidential disaster declarations have been flood-related. Every state, all 50 states are impacted by flooding, and every single state has had one of those major disaster declarations related to flood in the past 10 years. And it's not just a coastal issue, it's an inland issue. In fact, the majority of the major flood events that happen are inland communities. They just don't always make the national headlines. And the costs have been on the rise since 2000. Flood-related disasters have cost the federal government over $750 billion. Unfortunately, our policy and regulatory environment that we have in place has enabled a lot of the damage and costs that we see today. Joanne did a very good job of talking about the history of the National Flood Insurance Program and how it came about, where the changes have been made along the road, and I think we are at one of those kind of turning points right now with this program. Larry asked me to sort of set the stage for what's happening in Congress, and we have the luxury of sitting in Washington, D.C. and working with our members of Congress and trying to figure out ways to improve the program. And one thing we have to often communicate is that the National Flood Insurance Program is part of a larger suite of policies that are in place, and fixing one doesn't mean that the whole problem is fixed and that we really need a holistic approach. If you look at the flood insurance program, you could argue that we have perverse incentives to live in risky areas. We subsidize some flood insurance rates. We bail people, communities, and states out when they're impacted by flooding. Further, we've encouraged more and more built infrastructure. We continue to put more people and more assets in harm's way. All the while, as a nation and as communities, we have historically underinvested in things like mitigation and preparedness and resilient infrastructure over the years. So we've layered on top of each other highly developed and densely populated areas, lack of funding, perverse incentives, and little emphasis on a big picture, holistic approach to reducing flood risk. So how do we fix it? That's what we're trying to do at Pew, working with a lot of partners in this room, including ASFPM. It's not an easy fix. This is something that crosses many different agencies. There are roughly 17 federal agencies that provide disaster relief. There are multiple committees in Congress that deal with this issue. And it's not just a federal fix. We have state and localities to deal with as well, but I'm going to talk about it today just from the federal perspective. What we're trying to do really is think about how do we sort of reverse or dismantle some of those perverse incentives that we have had on the books for many years, and how do we drive positive policies towards supporting smarter, more resilient investments, mitigation, the role that nature can play. If I look back on the hurricane season, which I know we've talked a lot about during this entire conference, if there's anything positive that came from the destruction that we saw throughout the Southeast, it's that it gave this issue a national platform for discussion and debate about what the problems are and what some of the solutions are. We've seen since August 17th of 2017, when Hurricane Harvey formed, Congress has introduced over 200 bills that address flooding and natural disasters. The president and the vice president at the time made 16 public speeches, I counted, about last year's hurricane season. And at its peak, there were over 4,000 media mentions of Hurricane Harvey. It really was a national discussion that landed on the front page of every single major newspaper and every single major news outlet. And I do think it has led to some positivity in terms of a little bit of a wake-up call for our national leaders who are thinking about policy. I'm going to start with the positive before we talk about the doom and gloom. But particularly when it comes to mitigation, we've seen some positive action this year from Congress. If you look at the FY18, the fiscal year 18 appropriations and budgeting process, which happened earlier in the year, FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program, which is one of the only programs available to communities before a disaster strikes, received historic levels of funding. That program received more than 3 times the average that it has received in the last 15 years, maybe ever. And the flood risk mapping program, also at FEMA, increased by $85 million. 2 programs that have been historically underfunded received, the pre-disaster mitigation program has traditionally received somewhere between $50 and $100 million, and when you divide that between 50 states, it's not that much. So we've seen some positive movement from Congress. I think there's a increasing understanding of the value of mitigation. We see the new research from NIBS that has come out that shows a 1 to 6 return on investment. We've also seen, as part of the $130 billion that Congress provided to the communities through supplemental funding to support the areas impacted by the disasters, that $12 billion of that $130 billion was specifically directed for the Department of Housing to go towards mitigation. That is one of the biggest and most unprecedented amounts of federal dollars being directed specifically towards mitigation that we have seen. And now there's even another proposal on the table that the Senate is considering and debating that would essentially say of future disasters, the overall cost, we're going to set aside on top of that cost a 6% bucket that is going to go just towards mitigation for states and communities to access on an ongoing basis to take on some of these pre-disaster mitigation activities that I know a lot of you in this room have been talking about doing, and we know that at the end of the day, financing is one of the biggest hurdles to getting these projects off the ground. So it's not all good news. Our dear friend, the National Flood Insurance Program, remains unchanged since 2014, vulnerable to lapses because Congress continues to kick the can on reforming the program and has done so 6 times already since September. If they do it again this summer, that'll make it 7 since the hurricane season. Now, it is for good reason. This is a complicated program that deserves complicated attention, some of which are pretty controversial issues to deal with, but at some point, Congress has to put pen to paper and really put in some thoughtful reforms to improve the program. So I've tried to simplify, perhaps oversimplify for those of you in this room who work day in and day out on this issue, some of the thorny issues that are up for debate in Congress today. And Joanne touched on these because some of these are the themes that have been reoccurring throughout the program as some of the major components, but also some of the major kind of thorny issues. The number one, rates. How do you put the program on a financially solvent path through rates that reflect true risk? The program is today $14 billion in debt. It has been in debt in the past and is sort of on a path right now where it is not on a financially solvent path. And so one of those big issues that Congress is trying to figure out is how do you balance rates that reflect true risk and how do you incorporate pieces of affordability? Second piece is communicating that risk. How do you increase the transparency of the program so that homeowners and communities understand their true risk and they're equipped with the information that they need and the knowledge to be making informed buying decisions? So that means rate transparency, risk transparency, more disclosure, more understanding, more improved mapping. The third, mitigation and mapping. How do you pay for and finance more mitigation? Now, I just talked about that the mitigation has had a very good year in 2018, but there are still ways through the National Flood Insurance Program that we can support mitigation. Everyone in Congress, both sides of the aisle, nods their head. Yes, we need more mitigation, but how do you pay for it is the big problem. The fourth piece that Joanne talked a little bit about is privatization. How do you shore up the federal program, the finances of the federal program, while still insuring people, while incorporating and easing the process for the private sector to write more flood insurance? At the end of the day, we know that flood insurance is the first line of defense. If you look at the average payouts of flood victims over the past disasters, those who had flood insurance simply received more financial support from the federal government than those that did not. And the fifth is repetitive loss, those areas around the country that have flooded over and over and over again. We all know where they are. There's a lot of discussion in Congress of how do you address this problem through community approaches, individual approaches, rate approaches, mitigation approaches. It's not an easy solution. And those are sort of the five very, very simplified themes that are happening in terms of the debates that are going on in Congress. And I'll just end really quickly by saying that this is not and should not be a partisan issue. We all know that floodwaters don't know jurisdictional lines, they don't care about congressional representation, and they don't know political party. We at Pew, we've conducted national polling that shows that this is an issue that is supported by Republicans, independents, and Democrats. We did polling in 2017, and then we did it again in this February of 2018. We specifically even tested the Southeast region, and I was terrified that the numbers were gonna be really low, where we saw members, the American voters in the Southeast that did not support issues like improving flood policies, requiring mitigation, flood standards, and we saw in the Southeast that those numbers were even higher than the general public across the United States. A couple of those numbers really quick. 7 in 10 registered voters across the U.S. support policies that will enable communities in the nation to better prepare for and respond to floods. 9 out of 10 support flood-ready building, which would require that federally financed infrastructure be built to better withstand the impacts of flooding. And 86% of those in states affected by hurricanes support a single national standard for property sellers to disclose past flooding during a sale. That's up from last year, up from before the hurricane season. So why isn't change happening? We hear from members of Congress all the time that they're not hearing from their constituents. We have 1,000 people in this room that raised their hand and said they think that the program needs to be improved. I would encourage you to walk out of here at 10 o'clock and call your member of Congress and tell them that they need to do something before the program expires July 31st. Thank you.